Hey everyone, welcome to Food Talk with Dani Nierenberg. I am so excited to talk to someone I greatly admire and have talked to before, Tom Philpott, who is a senior research associate at the Johns Hopkins Center for a Livable Future. He's an author and a food and agriculture advocate. What other titles can I give you, Tom? What else do you do?
Journalist, I guess I was a journalist for a long time, staff writer at Mother Jones and
Yeah,
before that, but I still have one foot in that world. I still
yeah,
freelance. Um, book, yeah, you said author. I wrote a book that came out a couple years ago, so you got that covered.
really
So
good book.
thank you. Yeah, you interviewed me right when it came out, which I greatly appreciated.
No, 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 it's our pleasure. And everyone, Perilous Bounty. Yes, everyone should go
Correct.
read that book. It's very good. So, I want to talk a little bit to start off because you were an author, a journalist for so long at Mother Jones, and everyone, sort of, followed you regularly because of your food and agriculture reporting. And I know you still write for them. What was that transition like to sort of a more academic setting, even though it's the Center for a Livable Future, which is such an awesome place to sort of learn and advocate?
Yeah, I mean, it was kind of intense because journalism is a pretty fast-paced environment.
Hmm.
You're always under a deadline. If you're a staff writer, you're always under a deadline. And when you finish one, there's always one right behind
Right,
you. So
right.
you're never quite really done, and you're never quite working fast enough. There's always, always pressure to do more, more, more. And that's just the nature of journalism. Um, and especially if you're going to be a staff writer on a publication, that's just sort of what
Right.
you're signing up for. Nothing to do with Mother Jones itself. So it was great for me to step out of that kind of cycle,
Right.
have a little bit more time to think things through, and to get involved in conversations about the food system and about food policy, food culture. Without having to write something about it or produce a
Mhm.
product from it. But to still have the opportunity, they're very encouraging for me of me to freelance here. Yeah, as long as it's on the topic. I'm not gonna, write movie,
Right.
maybe not be so popular if I started to spend a lot of time writing movie reviews or something.
I would read them.
Okay. But but as long as I'm writing about our general topic, which is sort of food politics, food policy, especially, geared toward industrial animal production,
Yeah.
then they're fine with it. So it's been a really good combination for me and just a way to take a breather from the sort of hubbub of journalism.
Yeah, and I want to get into industrial animal production in a minute, but just on the subject of journalism in general, we have seen so much sort of decline and reporting on food and agriculture in media. Why are outlets not focused on these issues? Mother Jones certainly is, but there are so many other magazines and newspapers are just not reporting on food and agriculture, especially in relationship to the climate crisis.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's multiple reasons. I mean, I think that, the one sort of macro reason is that media is just under a lot of pressure right now in general.
Yeah.
And so that's one reason why you're seeing less coverage of this topic, just because the old business models have really withered away, and there's a lot of experimentation about new business models, and nothing is really stuck yet. And
Yeah.
so, we are seeing, just this hemorrhaging of, critical sort of fact-based media outlets right now. And that's a big part of it. And the second is, you know, I don't even know if I have a good answer for it because, I was talking to Kate Cox a while back, and Kate Cox
Mhm.
was the sort of founding editor of the Counter, the late and lamented
Yep,
Counter.
yep. Great. It was such a great website. It was awesome.
Yeah, it's a great sort of food politics news site. Ran amazing stuff. And she, classic example of this sort of new media operation with this new business model, which is basically get a billionaire or some very rich person to fund your publication, which, can be a great business model for a time. But when that billionaire or rich person pulls the plug, which is what happened to them,
Yeah.
then you're back where you started from with nothing, and that's what happened to Kate. But one of the things that Kate talked about, we did we're doing this annual fellowship for food system journalists at Hopkins, and
Nice.
we did a soft launch of it last year in June, and we're going to do it again. We're going to get 6 fellows, 6 to 8 fellows to come in who are mid-career journalists and give them a crash course in food systems with our
Hmm.
Hopkins researchers here, do a field
Nice.
trip because around here in Baltimore, we're very close to a lot of industrial chicken production, for
Yep.
example, industrial seafood production. So lots of opportunities to go do field trips. And the third day, we have journalists come in on the beat and talk to the fellows. And she was one of them. And she made the point at our presentation that I thought was really interesting that these topics are really engaging. People
Hmm.
click on them. I remember
Hmm.
Mother Jones. I don't recall complaints about my stuff not getting enough traffic. Like
Right. Right.
writing about, the various issues with the food system, people are interested in it.
Yeah.
It was just like, we started, we rolled out the counter on the idea that this is really engaging stuff that people will come to, they'll read it, and we were right. We got plenty of engagement. And she was like, I don't understand why editors don't get that. I don't understand why
Mhm.
it's the first thing to get marginalized. And I think there is, I mean, part of the rationale for our food system journalism fellowship was that to sort of capacitate journalists to feel comfortable in the topic because it is so complicated and there is
Yeah.
so much information out there, and you really kind of have to, like, I've been on the beat for 20 years, and I still feel like it's a lot to keep up with, and there's a lot of
Yeah.
things coming out to keep up with. And so I think there's a lot of, I think, maybe a part of it is there aren't a lot of editors out there who feel comfortable editing pieces on it because they don't feel like they have a big enough knowledge base.
Hmm.
And there
Hmm.
are not enough reporters out there who might think, hey, this is an interesting story, but oh my God, it's so complicated talking about,
Yeah.
meat packing workers or
Or
environmental impact of a giant hog CAFO, in your community. What does that mean? And so I think that's maybe one of the problems. And so that's what we're kind of trying to address. And we actually had an editor, we actually opened the fellowship to editors, feeling
nice.
like there's leverage. If there's an editor who's more confident in assigning these stories, maybe there'll be more stories. And so
Absolutely.
so yeah, I think there's a macro problem of just a collapsing business model, and there are successful projects, and I think Mother Jones is one of them. And
Yeah.
it was kind of one of the first nonprofit newsrooms, and now there are and it was exotic even as recently as 10 years ago, and now there's
Or
a whole bunch of them, and that creates a new problem of like you as a reader, you've got, instead of Mother Jones saying, "Hey, can you give us $5 a month?" You've got 8 publications that you really like, and maybe 7 more Substack writers all asking you for
yeah.
$5 or $7 a month, and it
Yeah.
gets to be a really crowded field. But I think that's basically it. That we haven't that the business model sort of meltdown remains in effect. We haven't figured it out yet, and so there's just less journalism in general. And then there's this problem, I think, of editors not seeing that food system stories actually do get engagement. People like them.
Right, right. Yeah, absolutely. I also think, Tom, and I don't know if you agree or disagree, but I think it's a really scary time for journalists right now. I was talking to Kim Severson from the New York Times, food business writer, earlier this year, and they're expecting an onslaught, and we're already seeing it from the Trump administration of lawsuits and that kind of thing. What do you expect to happen over the next 4 years of this administration in terms of how journalists might be hindered in reporting?
I mean, there will definitely be loads and loads of attacks, and there are also be lots of time and resources tied up into basically kind of playing defense or kind of reacting to the outrage of the day. And you can't kind of turn your head away from it because, like right now, Dani, we live in Baltimore, in the sort of greater, just outside of the DMV, where
Yep.
there's this horrible plane crash last night.
Yep.
And I've been kind of doing stuff all morning and not following the news, but I'm just understanding that Trump, this is January 30th, used the occasion as an example, as a opportunity to go off on a rant against DEI and literally
Yep.
blame this crash
Yep.
on diversity and hiring at the FSA. And that just sort of, it's terrible. It's newsworthy. It has to be reported on. And it just sucks up all these resources. And then someone's going to have to fact check it. And,
Right.
there is the whole question of what does fact checking do now? If he says it, he's got people who are going to believe it, are going to be like, oh my God,
Right. Right.
someone who doesn't look like me made a mistake, and that's why all these people died.
Right.
So, but I also think, beyond that, the sort of distraction, the constant distraction element, I do think there are going to be lawsuits filed against critical journalism. And, that just throws more gum into the works and
Yeah.
more expense. It's more, and then, at the end of the day, you get calculations like, well, this is a good story. It's an important story. We know we're going to get sued if we run it. Is it worth the cost benefit to run this story? And that
Right.
is going to become a thing. And
That's the scariest part of it all to me,
yeah,
that like there's going to be that weighing of like whether we should do this or not, even though it's really important for people to know.
yeah, and I think the best publications are going to go forward and do it, but it's going to be a bunch of playing defense, and there is going to be a bunch of time spent in lawsuits. When I was at Mother Jones, completely nothing to do with me, but I was there for 11 years, and I think for 6 or 7 of those years, we were involved in a completely frivolous slap suit against Mother
Mm.
Jones. It took all this time and resources that took our amazing leadership team, just they had to spend a whole bunch of time dealing with it. And you could feel it when it finally lifted,
Yeah.
that there
Yeah.
was more time and space to think about the journalism. And it just
Yeah.
makes me think of, what's going to happen going forward.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is just a really important time to support the kind of the media that you like, that you rely on, whatever it is.
Right.
It's the time to rally around those organizations for sure.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. I do want to switch gears a little bit. We've been talking about the Trump administration. I'm sure you watched the confirmation hearings for both Brooke Rollins, who's been nominated for Secretary of Agriculture, and Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who has been uh, um, nominated to lead Health and Human Services. Any thoughts that you want to share on, how that's going to affect our food and agriculture systems?
Yeah, I mean, it seems like the administration has really, when at this speech that Trump gave a week or two before the election, Madison Square Garden, kind of infamous rally, Madison Square Garden. He talked about Kennedy and he said, I'm going to let Kennedy go wild on food and health, but I'm going to draw the line. He's already, before the election, putting a box around Kennedy. He's not going to get anywhere near fossil fuel, oil.
Mm,
That stuff
mm,
is sacred. He says this explicitly. That's liquid gold. He won't be able to touch it.
sure.
So we already going in, we see this box forming around Kennedy, and then, putting him to HHS versus USDA. You're putting him. So, the way I've described Kennedy, he's got some, not crazy ideas
Right.
about ag policy reform.
Right.
He's got,
Right.
sort of diversifying agriculture, stopping supporting, highly processed, ultra processed foods going into school lunches and things like that. And then he's got some utterly insane ideas around vaccinations. And I should just say
Right.
briefly that my mother had polio, and so I take it really personally
Yeah.
and she had a very, very difficult time with it. She got it just before the vaccine came out, and I take it very personally when someone has a petition before the FDA, as his group does, to revoke the polio vaccination. This is utter madness. Um, and um, and so Trump has put him in a position where he can actually affect stuff like vaccines, but he doesn't have any purview over agriculture policy. I mean, you could
Mhm.
say with I think HHS and the USDA they sort of intermingle to do the dietary guidelines, and it's
Sure.
possible that the dietary guidelines could get, I mean, he also there's a bunch of BS in his food spiel as well. And
Sure.
so that could
Tell
get
us
in.
more.
Yeah.
Tell us more.
Well, I mean, like he demonizes, like I don't even know what the nutrition meat bros mean when they say seed oil.
Right. Right.
Demonize the seed oil. Is flaxseed oil a seed oil? Did they
Yeah.
demonize that too? But that kind of stuff. And but so there could be some potential good things to happen with the dietary guidelines, but he's got zero influence over farm policy, and I
Yeah.
feel like he's sort of been boxed out of that. And then so that sort of sends us over to Brooke Rollins, and everything from her background to her testimony at her hearing suggests that she's going to be the sort of second coming of Sonny Perdue.
Yeah. Yeah.
She said that, Trump, when he was having his trade war with China and China retaliated with soybean tariffs, he basically pumped billions of dollars into corn and soybean producers to prop up the current system, prop up current levels of production,
Yeah.
even though China wasn't buying their stuff anymore. And that just sort of perpetuates this system we have of propping up corn and soybeans above all else and overproducing them and putting their, sweeteners and fats and stuff into ultra processed foods. And she also, just like Fannie Purdue, she's, not going to push back on anything he does with immigration, including
Right. Right.
if it hounds his if some of the farmers that support him see their workforces hounded, that's just going to be someone else's problem. And I think what their solution to that is they're probably going to try to, and I think this is gets to some tensions within MAGA, but the solution will be to try to expand the guest worker programs, which often act like essentially indentured servitude, especially, and we
Right.
had
Right.
a national debate about this with these really high-end H-1B, I think they're called. There's sort of like engineers and people like that, and some of the
Okay.
MAGA
Okay.
people want to completely halt those.
Okay.
And those are people making, often six-figure salaries, but the ones that are in use in agriculture are people making more like $15 an hour usually. And it can be like indentured servitude because you get that visa, you can work for one farm, and if you don't like the way you're treated there, you can either kind of go home or you just have to keep dealing with it.
Right. Right.
And we've seen documented over and over again abuses in that program, and that's going to be the solution. And they can probably get Democratic support to expand that. There has been in the past, but it's also, the MAGA base may not stand for that, and so
Sure.
we could
Sure.
see a huge crisis with labor and farming that Brooke Rollins has said she's definitely not going to push back on anything they do on that front.
Yeah, I try to remain sort of non-biased on all of this, but I can't right now. It's just I think both of these people are not qualified for the positions they've been nominated for, and that's what really concerns me because they have so many employees that will be, looking to them for leadership, and they have so much to do. And it's very disheartening. I
Yeah,
want
and
to,
we've also heard about the purges about
right.
sort of career civil servants in both of those agencies. I think we're going to see a lot of hemorrhaging of that and a lot of political appointees taking their places, and that's also very scary.
Yeah, and like on the international front, the purging of career folks at USAID and elsewhere, and the suspension of funding, these things are very serious and will have serious impacts, across the United States for sure, but across the world in terms of food aid and other things that the United States, that other countries depend on the United States to provide, and these are very scary times. Research will be set back. We're already yeah, these last 10 days losing lots of good research in agriculture that, we'll never get back probably.
No doubt.
Yeah. I want to turn to things that I know you're interested in. I'm going to ask you about another journalist first. So, Michael Grunwald argued last December in the New York Times, again, mentioned the New York Times, that it's a necessity for to have an industrialized food system, especially here in the United States. And I wonder what your thoughts were when that came out. I know folks like you and I know, like Anna Lappé had very strong reactions. I think a lot of us did. What came to mind when that was published?
Yeah, it's funny. I know Michael, it's just sort of online over many years because we were both writing critically about the corn ethanol program in the 2000s, 2000,
Mhm.
2005 to 2010 period. He was at Time back when it was a big publication, and I was at Grist, and we were kind of comrades who were some of the only journalists, especially early on, really pushing back on this as a really
I
dumb idea.
remember.
We yeah, we kind of bonded over it. Some said at the time that I was in an ethanol bubble, but I would occasionally come out and write about other stuff.
Right.
But So I know Michael. He's a very smart guy. He's a very good writer. I also know him as a very good reporter. He went on to work at Politico and do some great features for them. I don't agree with everything he writes outside of food. But on this issue, I have to say that I think he's got an incredibly blinkered view based
Mm,
on the writing. And I think what it really kind of comes down to is this philosophical question of, are people part of ecology, part of the environment, or are people apart from it? And
right.
the view he's taking is that, and I think it's there's a common strain of thinking that goes by the name of eco-modernism that kind of that also is kind of like in league with what Michael's doing in this piece. And he's got a book coming out. This piece was
Mhm.
an excerpt from the book, which will be coming out in a couple of months, and which I'm hoping to review somewhere. I haven't got an advanced copy yet, but so it's this idea that people are apart from the environment, and so what you want to do is you want to have sort of dense cities, which I totally agree with, people living in dense cities, and then you want to have farming areas that are really, really intensively farmed, and you basically contain, quote unquote, contain that stuff. So it's just like,
Mm,
yeah, you don't want to see it, like you put the original picture on the New York Times website, at least. I never saw the hard copy, but it was a big gnarly, cattle farm in California with like
right.
a bunch of cows plunked together on brown dirt, eating corn.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's like, this is the future of farming. This is the way to do it. And so the idea is to contain it. And because it's so efficient, according to the argument, we can get less land doing it. So we have our farming area, we've got our cities where we contain humans. Everything else we can rewild.
Yeah.
We can just send it back to wild nature. And that is sort of the idea. And the problem, philosophically, I don't separate people from nature. I think we're part of nature. It's
Right.
inevitable.
Right. Agreed.
We live, we consume, we produce waste. We're part of nature, and how we live in nature is important. But apart from the philosophical argument, I don't think it turns out that you can contain industrial agriculture. Like, this is a fantasy of containment.
Yeah.
And I can think of a bunch of different ways that where that's true. For example, and I've written a whole bunch about this. The way that we produce animals creates an ideal environment for viral pathogens to reproduce, replicate, mutate in ways that can harm us dramatically.
Yeah. Yeah.
We had in 2009, largely forgotten incident where there was actually a swine flu pandemic.
Right.
It was the first pandemic declared since the 60s, as I recall. I reported a bunch
Mhm.
on it at the time. This is 2009, and basically it definitively came from a factory scale hog farm in Mexico. And it's
Yeah.
spread out from there and it's spread into the human population. And what hogs are really, really good at doing is taking, including avian pathogens, bird
Hmm.
flus, that, as we're seeing with bird flu is really scary, but humans don't do it doesn't do a very good job of being contagious among humans. So a human can get a
Right.
case of it. It could be really bad. They could die from that case of it because our immune systems are naive to it. But it doesn't do a very good job of like spreading to the next person. So uh,
Right.
it's largely contained. The reason why it's so scary that it's gone to cows is that that's showing a mutation. Somehow it
Yeah.
mutates to be able to go to cows, and it could happen with humans. And there's no way to contain that, and you can't vegan your way out of that. You can't say, uh,
Yep.
I'm I'm gonna I'm gonna like not participate in this
Right. Right.
terrible. I'm gonna eat less meat. I'm gonna not participate in this terrible system. You could still get that. Another way that it can't be contained is antibiotic resistance. Something that
Right.
my center here, CLF, has been publishing about for years and years now, decades now.
Yeah.
And basically, the way that we're doing to this day, despite the Obama reforms, we are using the great majority of human relevant antibiotics on giant livestock farms, and that is making their effectiveness is it's developing resistance and making their effectiveness less and less. And we're still moving toward a post-antibiotic world, which is a really, really terrifying
Yeah.
place.
Yeah.
And industrial farming isn't the only cause of that, but it is a one of the primary causes of that. Research has shown that a million times, and you can't contain that. You could try to improve the antibiotic the antibiotic efficiency. You could try to get them to use less. Attempts to regulate them in the United States have basically failed, except for in the case
Yeah.
of, well, they've just failed. Poultry self-regulated on its own.
Yeah.
Um, and then another way that it's impossible to contain is that these operations produce way too much waste. You're
Hmm. Hmm.
concentrating waste in a way that it can't be disposed of in any kind of way that doesn't cause problems. And right now, the biggest problems, the people who are really on the cutting edge of that problems are low income rural communities in places like North Carolina, which are
Yeah.
heavily people of color, in eastern North Carolina counties like Sampson and Duplin. But we're also seeing, it has to be said. So I think that, people could hear that and be like, oh, well, that's a shame, but maybe those people should move out of those regions. Maybe we should just depopulate those regions.
Hmm.
Even that doesn't work because if you look at the Corn Belt, you look at the Midwest, we think of the Corn Belt, there's these vast fields of corn and soybeans in Iowa, but there's also a bunch of cities in the Corn Belt. There's a
Yeah.
bunch of population centers in the Corn Belt. And
I
and
grew up in one of them. I get it. Yeah.
yeah. And what we're seeing is water pollution on a scale. So basically, what you've done is you've created a system where you're growing all these corn and soybeans that require this incredible amount of fertilizer, as feed for the feed crop. And in
Hmm.
creating this, you're polluting the water with nitrates and
Yeah.
phosphorus, which is causing, there's a lot of research coming out about how nitrates at low levels, we used to think they weren't that big of a deal under 10
Hmm.
parts per million, because
Hmm.
under three, so when you hit 3 parts per million, no, I'm sorry, when you go over 10 parts per million, you're risking giving like basically giving babies this really devastating problem called blue baby syndrome, where they can't process oxygen. Their bodies can't get
Yeah.
enough oxygen. And
Right.
and so the idea was, well, if we get under 10 parts per million, we're not going to have blue babies. And so the problem is solved. And what
Mm.
we're finding is that under 10 and as low as 3 parts per million, we're seeing that nitrate pollution in water contributes to all kinds of cancers. And
Yeah.
throughout the Midwest, and people who rely on wells, people who live in cities like Des Moines are getting water that's, 9.5 parts per billion, and it's chronic, and you're told that
Yeah.
it's safe, and you're ingesting it, and it's Iowa has got the fastest growing. It's got among the fastest growing cancer. I think it's the second highest cancer rate after Kentucky, and it's got the fastest growing
Wow.
cancer rates. And it's the kinds of cancers, colorectal cancers, cancers of that system
Yeah.
that nitrate use is known to be a trigger for. And so,
Yeah.
this is another way that this fantasy of containment that he's talking about isn't viable. There's also air pollution. There,
Right. All
yeah,
these externalities, right?
yeah, and so I think the sort of eco-modernist sort of Michael Grunwald solution is like, well, we need to really work on containing those areas, and I think that's a fantasy. And
Yeah.
and then then maybe they'll say better regulation. Well, this is an industry that is really difficult to regulate because they have so much political power.
Right.
And then if you want to regulate them, then you need to join our struggle and not say everything's fine. This is the future of farming,
Right.
because regulating them is going to take a huge political push and a lot of organizing and writing articles saying, "Hey, everything's fine with agriculture," is not going to get you very far.
Well, and I also wonder who wants to work at these places? Like, if we're going to contain these factory farms out, beyond cities, who it's going to be the same people who work at them now, people who are marginalized and,
Yeah.
and abused, right?
Yeah, and I think to hear Michael tell it, I think we basically already have them contained. We've got the Corn Belt, where a whole bunch of feed production happens and also a bunch of animal production happens. We've got North Carolina, rural North Carolina, where a bunch of hog production happens. We've got the Delmarva Peninsula. These are fairly contained places.
Until
And
a hurricane hits.
yeah, oh, I know. That's another one. I mean, we could go on thinking of them. And hurricanes regularly rock both of those regions, especially North Carolina. And and yeah, the labor issue. Well, we need to have better labor laws. Okay, we'll join that struggle then. Don't tell us everything's fine. There's lots of NGOs we could talk about right now who are doing really important work on meatpacking workers.
Right.
Let's see you throw your support to them. One thing that I
Yeah.
can say is I don't think Michael Grunwald is going to be signing up to go work on one of these farms,
Right.
or
Right. Right.
one of these facilities.
Tom, one of the things that makes industrialized animal farming, CAFOs, factory farms so bad is the consolidation, right? And I was with our friend Chloe Sorvino, who's written a lot on this issue at Forbes, and I was with her last night at Bold Fork Books in Washington, D.C. to talk about the new edition of her book, Raw Deal. And can you talk to me how consolidation, tell me and our listeners how consolidation really impacts all of us as eaters?
Yeah, I mean, I think, there's a whole bunch of different ways to get into that conversation, but the way that I think about it most readily and the way that I kind of wrote about it in my book is that when you consolidate these industries into such big money-making operations, that they become really good at capturing the profits of food production. That there's like it's like this giant system of food production, and there's lots and lots and lots of costs that we've been talking about, externalized costs, and then there's also lots and lots of profits. And this consolidation means that just sort of a few players grab the great bulk of those profits. What they end up doing with those profits is, getting rich, one thing, but also and making their shareholders rich, making lots of money and paying their executives a lot. But they also take a portion of those profits and they invest them in lobbying and they invest them
Yeah.
in things like campaign finance, giving money to candidates. They invest them in sort of sort of cultural warfare ads, cultural warfare just in
Mhm.
general, like you know AOC or Kamala Harris wants to take your hamburger away, kind of
Right.
making stuff up like that, and sort of making meat into this sort of like masculine, whatever. They fund efforts like this. They and then they get lots and lots of political power, and then they make themselves essentially impossible to regulate.
Yeah.
Like Danny, we've both been in these trenches for a couple of decades now, and
Yep.
like,
Thanks. Thanks for telling everyone.
but it's true, right?
Yeah.
And I remember first, when I was first getting into this, seeing your name out there for what was the group? It was a global group.
My group that where I worked, it was the World
Yeah,
Watch Institute, but
yeah,
yeah,
World
founded by
Watch.
Lester Brown.
Yeah,
It no longer
exactly.
exists. Yeah. It no
Yeah,
longer exists, sadly. Yeah.
yeah, but that's when I was coming into this, and so many of the problems that we were talking about then, we're still talking about now.
Yeah.
Antibiotic resistance, meatpacking work, abuse of meatpacking workers, nitrate pollution. They exist and they've gotten worse.
Yeah.
And why is that? And it's this general lack of regulation. And why is regulation such a taboo? Well, it's this because these companies just have so much political power
Yeah.
that they've created a taboo on regulation. And so I think that like it basically this consolidation issue, it ends up being an attack on democracy
Yeah.
because if we can't vote, if we basically, I think we've seen this with we've had, since we started, when I started doing this, George Bush one was still president.
Hmm.
So I've seen a bunch of administrations. I'm sorry, George Bush two, that is. The son was president.
W. W,
Yeah,
you mean.
George
That's what I
W.
thought
Bush
you
was
were talking
president. And so I've seen two Democratic administrations, both of them which gave their policy over to Vilsack. Now Vilsack did some fine things in this term, but he was not a transformational figure. He was very much a status quo figure. And if you can't vote your way out of the status quo, then what kind of democracy do you have?
Right. Right. Yeah.
And so I think that like they basically consolidation, one of the big problems with it is it turns us into a sort of $1 one vote system instead of a system based on people power. And I think, that's a major problem.
Absolutely. How do we build, and I'm, to blame for this, like talking about the food movement in the United States or, this the social movement around food and agriculture around the world. Do we really have a food movement that can like, fight the forces that are in play right now?
I mean, I think we have the makings of one, we have the outline of one, and I think we over the past 20 years a couple times come close to galvanizing into a real one. But I don't think we should despair and say there is no food movement. I think people are still very concerned. I think that actually the candidacy of RFK Jr. As much as I don't respect this person or find him to be a compelling figure at all, I think that I was talking to Ken Cook this morning at BWG. I was on this live stream where we were watching Kennedy's hearing and talking a little bit about it. And and one thing that he was saying was that I didn't follow Maha really closely, the sort of Make America Healthy
Yeah,
Again.
right.
It rose up after Kennedy dropped out and went into league with Trump. But what he's saying is that it didn't focus on vaccines at all. It was not explicitly an anti-vax thing. It was really about food and farm policy.
Yeah.
And it was a lot about ultra processed foods and getting them out of our schools and stuff like that. And it was really popular. And
Yeah.
it was, the Trump people, they're lizard brain people, but they look at the polling and say, look, I think that, it was documented that Trump got scared that at first he thought Kennedy was gonna take votes away from the Democrats, and then he got scared that he's gonna take votes away from him, and he started courting him and
Hmm.
realized that this is something that I should, because people believe whatever I say. I'll just say that I believe in this stuff. And I think that like I don't think it, is why he got
Yeah.
elected, but it certainly didn't hurt. It certainly didn't
Right.
hurt. I mean, it was a pretty tiny margin election. And he believed enough in Kennedy to feel like he had to put him in the administration.
Yeah.
And so I do think there's energy out there, and I do think that a non right-wing populist, there's a non-right-wing populist way to gather that energy. And I think that one thing we saw with this whole Kennedy phenomenon is that it's quite possible. And I don't know if you read my Mother Jones piece that came out a couple days ago about this topic.
Yeah, yeah.
I mentioned in the I had a piece that just came onto the website a couple days ago, and but um, but my favorite example of the way the Democrats should be thinking about this is that there's this idea that when you go into Iowa in a national election, like let's say the Iowa caucuses, then you have to, go genuflect in front of ethanol, and you have to go to a giant hog farm and genuflect about these American
Hmm.
farmers are feeding the world, and not talk about consolidation, not talk about CAFO pollution, and so in 2020 we had a very interesting experiment where two candidates went into Iowa and came out with these big reform agendas. We're going to reform farm subsidies away from corn and soybeans, more towards environmental protection. We're gonna, just sort of this. We're gonna bust up the big seed and chemical companies.
Yeah,
We're gonna
yeah,
we're gonna rein in the meat companies, and that was Sanders and Warren. And Sanders and Warren come in. Bernie ties Mayor Pete for first. Warren comes in second, or third, let's say, them being the top three. Mayor Pete didn't have much of an ag agenda. Biden comes in a distant fourth. Tom Vilsack ran his campaign. Tom Vilsack said, "Don't do any of that stuff. Don't challenge big ag. Don't talk about
mm,
consolidation." And
yeah,
Warren plus Sanders, they got like four delegates to one over Biden, and they were going in there and disrespecting big ag at public forums in Iowa.
yeah,
Um, Someone else who did that was candidate Barack Obama in 2008. Came in and talked about CAFO pollution and talked about communities that didn't ask for these giant facilities coming into the areas.
yeah,
And he basically got on the political map by beating Hillary Clinton in Iowa and Iowa caucus, and he proceeded to take Iowa twice. So you don't have to let Tom Vilsack. Now, Obama is the one who unpowdered Tom Vilsack, and I complained about that at the time. 2008 when he did it, I was very angry about that. But you don't have to take this Vilsackian approach. You can talk about
yeah,
changing agriculture, healthier food, healthier
yeah,
farm. And it's this myth. And I think what really holds it back is this kind of fear of, well, we can't offend those interests, but also the Democrats get lots and lots of money. They get lots and
yeah.
lots of campaign finance from these companies. And
Sure.
that's something the party's going to have to turn away from going forward.
Yeah. I mean, campaign finance reform is drastically needed, but I also, going back to like Iowa, I've seen an appetite among farmers in the Midwest who, sort of have been forced into this vicious cycle of factory farming who want a way out of it. And I can see how, candidates talking about, let's get rid of big ag or big meat can be really appealing to folks who were like stuck. They're stuck,
Yeah.
they have those loans that they have to pay off. They have, to get their kids through school, all of those things. And so I think there is, for lack of a better word, an appetite for change in the Midwest and in the South and, around the country.
Yeah. And like so the last 2 months of the campaign, Trump had no food policy at all until Kennedy joined the campaign. He joins for about
Yeah.
2 months, as I recall. And in those 2 months, Trump himself is thundering against, industrial agriculture
Yeah.
on occasion. Kennedy's out there, talking a lot of smack about industrial agriculture, and Trump increased his lead in Iowa. Like Iowans were not like, oh my God, he's disrespecting industrial agriculture, going to vote for him. It didn't hurt him at all. And I think
Yeah.
Democrats need to take that lesson that you don't have to toe this line.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. It is a good lesson. I want to talk a little bit more about what you've been working on at the Center for a Livable Future at the Johns Hopkins School of Public Health. What are your favorite things to work on right now? What are you thinking about? You are one of my favorite thinkers. You're also a doer, but you do think deeply and intentionally about things, and that's what I admire most about you.
Well, thank you so much. One of the things I'm really proud of that we're working on right now is I've already talked about it was this journalism fellowship. that I think is going to be really exciting. Basically, Michael Pollan at Berkeley ran a Food and Society Fellowship, I think from
Right.
2011 to 2022.
I think you're right. Yeah.
Yeah, and
So
a
many good
lot,
people came out of that. Like
so
so
many
many
good
great.
people came
Yeah.
out of it.
Yeah.
So much good work got funded. We're also going to be funding work as well. Maybe not on the
That's
same level
awesome.
that the Pollen thing was doing. One of my big motivations in starting it, and and the center already had, we kind of came together. One of the first things we talked about when I was interviewing with them was this idea. So it was, not just my idea. They already had this kind of thing like this brewing, and so it was a good combination. But one of my really main things right now is that with, 20 years on the beat, I really, I really want to be a good mentor to other journalists, and I want for young journalists coming up, and I want to
Yeah.
give them straight talk about the industry, and also just a really good grounding in the beat. And so that's
Yeah.
exactly what this sort of systemizes that, and gives me a chance to meet and hang out with, and learn from the
Right.
young folks coming up. And so I really appreciate that. And just a way to sort of like use my knowledge and experience. When you've been writing for so long and writing so much as I have, it's like you kind of crave a non-verbal product, like a product that isn't like, here's
Right.
3,000 words by,
Right.
so and so date.
Right.
And it gives you something, I want to be involved in conversations. And then another one is, we're doing a podcast, about this? We'll have to have you on the podcast. It's called
That's.
Unconfined,
Oh
and
yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
it's basically just conversations with people in the so the broader topic is industrial food, animal production, and it's people who are doing interesting work on it, sort of researchers, but also people who live at the wrong end of it. Like our very first episode was a woman who lives in Sampson County, North Carolina, named Sherry White Williamson, who grew up in a sort of rural African American county with a lot of African American owned farmland. And over the course of her adult life, saw most of those farms, be lost,
Yeah.
be sold, and saw this CAFO industry come in and essentially fill the void.
Yeah.
And so she was just a fascinating person to talk about, and like to get her to tell the story, and to get her to talk about how the community is fighting back. That's the kind of conversation we have on the podcast.
I love it. So listen to Unconfined, read Perilous Bounty, go to Mother Jones and read Tom Philpott whenever he's writing. Check out the Center for a Livable Future. These are any other to-dos, any other rays of hope you want to leave us with, Tom Philpott?
If you're an early or mid-career journalist, look out for our call for applications. It'll be coming out here pretty soon.
And we'll have it, we'll write an article about it. It'll be on Food Tank, so we'll make sure that it gets to our readers and in our newsletter. Tom Philpott, you are amazing. I've always admired you. Thank you for doing the work that you do.
Right back at you, Danny. You've always been an inspiration. So glad to be on the podcast. Thank you for having me.
Thank you.